have a lively discussion. I won't speak for too long. I'll speak for about half an hour. And you should feel free after that to ask me any question that you like. And I do speak my mother tongue, Bangla. আমার नाम পরঞ্জয় গুহ ঠাকুর था और मेरा तीसरी और सबसे कमजोर भाषा है हिंदी. तीसरी भाषा है, कमजोर है, व्याकरण, लिंग, अतीत, भविष्य इधर उधर हो जाता है. फिर भी मैं कोशिश करता हूं लोगों के साथ हिंदी में वार्तालाप करने के लिए. So I try and work in 3 languages. The reason why I also work in Bengali and Hindi is simple. I think I reach out to larger numbers of people. If I speak in a language they understand, English remains a language of the elite, if you like. Nevertheless, I'm going to do most of my talking today in English, maybe a little bit of Bengali and Hindi thrown in, but the idea is to try and explain, based on my own personal experience and what I know and what I've studied and what I'm trying to understand, why the media in India is as subservient as it is. I mean, why is it so servile? I mean, why are so many newspapers, television channels, radio is another story. India is arguably one of the few, if not the only major, quote unquote, democracy in the world where news and current affairs on the radio is still a monopoly of the government. But when you look at newspapers, when you look at magazines, when you look at television channels, and you look at the websites associated with all these publications and television channels, why are they so servile? Why are they not criticizing the government? Why are they not asking tough questions to those who are in positions of power and authority? Well, why are our journalists, my brothers, my sisters in the profession, why are they wary of holding truth to power, of holding accountable those who are in positions of power? They could be political personalities, they could be the heads of corporate conglomerates, they could be military officers, there could be officers, civil servants, officers in the bureaucracy. And therefore, why are they unwilling to ask? Why are journalists, my sisters and brothers, why are they not asking them difficult questions? You could argue that part of this has something to do with the overall environment that is prevailing. After all, when you look at Prime Minister Narendra Modi, our Honorable Prime Minister is the first, I underline, the first Prime Minister of India who has never addressed an unscripted media conference since he became Prime Minister in May 2014. Earlier, he did have a few such press conferences. But after he became Prime Minister, he has not had a media conference where journalists can ask him any question, spontaneously, follow-up questions. So far, the interviews that he's granted have been to people he's selected. And most of them have not asked him very tough questions. Most of them have not followed up questions. So if, for instance, he asked a question about demonetization or unemployment, after Mr. Narendra Modi answers the question, the interviewer, typically she or he does not follow up. That's one way. And certainly a lot of questions that were asked of him earlier are no longer asked of him. I suppose many would argue that after he faced a lot of flack in the media in the wake of the 2002 communal riots in Gujarat, Mr. Modi became wary of large sections of the media, or certain sections of the media. You remember very famously, he walked out of a meeting, an interview with Karan Thapar. So if the most important person in the man, and here I mean, the press conferences, the media conferences are really often being addressed by the Union Home Minister, Amit Shah. In fact, before the Lok Sabha elections, the results of the 2019 Lok Sabha elections were announced, there was an occasion where Mr. Modi was sitting next to Mr. Amit Shah. And when questions were addressed to him, it was Mr. Amit Shah who answered the questions. Now, whether this is a deliberate strategy or not is a matter of opinion. You can make up your own judgment. You can decide what you want to do. So the point that I wanted to make here is that when those at the very top, and I say the Prime Minister of India, is only willing to answer questions from selected journalists, then you have an overall atmosphere that is prevailing where journalists are not exactly encouraged for asking difficult questions or trying to hold accountable the Prime Minister or the Home Minister or anybody in power. Now, before I proceed further, I just want to give some of you who do not know me just a little introduction to myself. I am 65 years old. I've been a journalist for 43 years. I worked across the media. I worked in the print medium, the television medium, in radio, the written word, the spoken word, the audiovisual medium. I teach about the media. I've been teaching regularly at the Indian Institute of Management at Ahmedabad for the last 16 years as a member of the visiting faculty. I've written or co-authored 7 books. 2 of them deal with the media. One is a textbook on media ethics. The other is on the real face of Facebook in India. That the real face of Facebook in India came out was published in 2019. I was the publisher and one of the authors. I'm very proud to tell you that it's been printed and republished in 4 languages. The most recent one was a revised, enlarged edition that came out in Bengali. Orko Deb is the person who really put it together, and that was launched in Kolkata in February. So I have 2 books on the media. I've written quite a bit about the media. I try and study the media. In order to be able to teach, I also need to study. So these are my credentials. I make documentary films. I make short videos. And if you visit my website, paranjoy.in, that's a repository of my work. But I thought I should introduce myself to tell you why I'm speaking on this subject and why I'm concerned. I mean, I became a journalist in 1977. My last 2 years at the University of Delhi roughly coincided with the emergency. And a lot of people ask me, why did you become a journalist? Who should be held responsible? So I said the person who should be held responsible is Indira Gandhi, the late Indira Gandhi, and her son, the late Sanjay Gandhi. And I became a journalist. I remained a journalist. I consider myself truly honored and privileged that I'm also a teacher, because at that time I was in 2 minds in 1977 whether I wanted to be a teacher or a journalist. And I'm privileged because I'm a bit of both. I focus largely on the print medium. I worked in Business India, Business World, The Telegraph, India Today magazine, the pioneer under Vinod Mehta. Then for about almost 6 years, I was a full-time idiot on the Idiot Box when I worked with Television 18, and then I worked for almost 8 years with Lok Sabha Television. I've been doing all kinds of things. I had a brief stint of 15 months as the editor of the Economic and Political Weekly in 2016 and 17. Well, there's much more. If you want to know more about me, you're welcome to go to my website and check it all out. But I'm today here talking about why the media in India is so subservient. Now, the media is quite heterogeneous. I mean, it's almost as heterogeneous as the country is. But in certain ways, the media also does not reflect the heterogeneity or the plurality of this country. But we're the only country in the world where at one point of time, we had 100,000 publications registered with the Registrar of Newspapers of India. After this first round of COVID and the second surge of the pandemic, I really wonder how many of these publications are going to survive. I would not be surprised if large numbers of them actually close down. This is at one level an international phenomenon. At another level, it's also true for India. I mean, it's not that people are not reading, but a lot of people, especially young people, are reading less and less on pieces of paper and more on screens, whether the screens be on their lap or on their hand or wherever. That's the reading part of it. Listening and viewing, yes, that's going to continue, and that has indeed been happening. I mean, when you look at each one of these segments, India is unique. I mean, as I told you, India is unique because we are the world's largest democracy, and news and current affairs on the radio is still a monopoly of the government. But when you look at television, we had one broadcaster in the early 90s, in 1991. That was Doordarshan, Prasar Bharati Corporation. Today, if you visit the website of the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, you'll find that there are roughly 900 television channels that have got permission from the Government of India, the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, to uplink or downlink. And out of these 900, roughly a third of them claim that they're news and current affairs channels. There are two categories of television channels. But what we've seen in India is the explosion of the social media. I mean, just to give you a few numbers to just let you know how widespread and ubiquitous the phenomenon is. I mean, we live in a planet where there are about 7.5 billion people. India is soon going to become the most populous country on this planet. We have about 1.35 billion, 135 crore people. A lot of people are not aware of the fact that if you look at the number of SIMs, SIM, subscriber identity module, this is the chip that goes inside your mobile phone. आपका जो चलायमान दूरभाष यंत्र है ना, उसके अंदर जो चिप चला जाता है, और अगर आपका दूरभाष यंत्र अत्यंत चालाक है, very very smart, then you are even more privileged. But the point is, in a country of 135 crore people, and there are of course many infants, there are over 110 crore, 1.1 billion SIMs. What does this mean? That in most parts of the country, there are more SIMs than human beings. Once upon a time, this was a phenomenon that was largely confined to the urban areas and the metros, the metropolitan areas. Now it's all over the country, even in smaller towns and villages, earlier areas which were remote. More SIMs than human beings. Now, India is, as I was mentioning, soon going to overtake China as the most populous country on the planet. But when you look at the number of users of mobile phones, it's not that there are, just because there are 110 crore or 1.15 billion SIMs, it doesn't mean there are that many telephone subscribers. These numbers vary. There are various estimates, or some would call guesstimates. But most people would agree that there are over 700 million, over 70 crore, some would say 75 crore users of mobile phones in this country. Compare that with the total number of people who are adults. Now, in 2019, the last Lok Sabha elections that took place in India, there were roughly 90 crore, 900 million Indians who were above the age of 18 with effect as on the 1st of January 2019. India's is a young population. Out of this 135 crore Indians, about half are below the age of 26. Some would say the median age, that's the age where the maximum number of Indians are somewhere in the region of about 200, is about 26 or 27. Now, when you look at the number of users of the social media, it's phenomenal. Just take one example, WhatsApp, which is the most popular social messaging application. And it's part of the Facebook corporate conglomerate. It's part of that big digital monopoly. WhatsApp has the maximum number of users in India. Until recently, it was about 400 million. According to the government of India, that number has now exceeded 500 million. There are more than 50 crore Indians who use WhatsApp. Now, this is the sheer scale of WhatsApp. Now, WhatsApp has become a vehicle for dissemination of each and every kind of information, including information that's false, that's fake, that's untrue, which is hateful, which is pornographic, which is criminal in nature. I mean, that there have been instances of people being killed and those videos being disseminated. But because you have what is called end-to-end encryption, It's not easy to ascertain who has produced that content first and how has it been disseminated. If you go through the book that I co-authored called The Real Face of Facebook in India, you'll know how it has been converted into a weapon, a propaganda weapon, an instrument of disinformation and propaganda. It's not that disinformation, falsehoods, lies, half-truths were not used earlier, were not propagated earlier, but the sheer speed, the sheer scale is unprecedented. And these are all for-profit organizations. And because they are for-profit organizations, those who are going to pay, they are the ones who benefit. WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram, part of the same organization, other digital monopolies, other digital platforms, they don't really care whether that information is true, false, half-true, tendentious, hateful, so long as it goes viral. Now, that is the problem. Now, that's another subject for discussion. But one of the reasons why the mainstream media has been so subservient in India, and I'm returning to the main topic of our discussion, is that it's got a lot to do with the revenue model, the business model. Commentator Banya has made a sarcastic remark. She or he has claimed, so all of the media's servility is Modi's fault, really? I never said so. I said when the Prime Minister of India does not have an unscripted press conference or media conference, it sends a certain message. When the Prime Minister believes in communicating with the people of this country and one way, Man Ki Baat, it also sends a message. Now, to go back to that point that I was making about the revenue model or the business model. Typically, the traditional business model, the revenue model of mainstream media organizations, that is newspapers and television channels, have been advertisers. Advertisers include not just private corporate bodies, but also government bodies. I mean, the biggest advertiser today in India is various agencies of the government of India, including public sector organizations, which are owned and by and large controlled by the government of India. So, what happens is that there's an old saying, he who pays the piper calls the tune. That's exactly what's happening. Now, what has been the change? When you look at what's happening across the world, and I'll briefly talk about that, then come to India, if you look at the last 15 years, and this trend got accelerated after the great Wall Street crash, the Great Recession, which was 2008, and thereafter in 2020, this trend got accelerated. So what happened was that expenditure on advertising either slowed down, that's the rate of growth slowed down, as in India. In many parts of the world, it either stagnated or actually came down. Expenditure on advertising started moving to the digital medium. And the mainstream, the so-called traditional mainstream media, जो परंपरागत जो मुख्य धारा में जो लोक माध्यम था, उनके पास जो विज्ञापनदाता जो खर्च कर रहे थे, वो नहीं बना. Now, what did that mean? That means that the expenditure on reportage, on investigations, on journalists started coming down. Newspapers started shutting down. Television channels started coming down. To survive, they had to be big. So there were mergers. But there's something also that happened, and this is where I come back to India, for instance, is that because of the recession and post-COVID, this trend was intensified, the expenditure on advertising of many private sector organizations also came down. Therefore, the dependence on government and government bodies on advertising went up, relatively speaking. This is an important reason that if the government, central government, in some cases state government, if they are the major sponsors, then you don't want to antagonize them. You say, how will I pay my employees? How will I keep things going? So you became subservient to whoever was in power. Now, from here comes the digital media. The digital media started, they were less, I mean, to start a digital media organization, you didn't need that kind of resources as you would if you had to print a newspaper or run a television channel, broadcast it live, cable. The economics of it is quite complicated. But the short point is that the digital media started playing a more antagonistic role, a more adversarial role. Websites, I could name a whole lot of them. They were willing to ask those tough questions. They were willing to ask those those difficult questions. And today we now see that the government, having realized that, is using issues like the dissemination of fake news, false news, which is correct. Also, this whole issue of privacy, we still don't have a law in place, but these become reasons, I would even say excuses, for the government to actually try and control the digital media more than before. This is a trend that we see. And it's not just over the top platforms, OTT platforms like Netflix, like Amazon Prime, and the censorship of films, whether or television serials, whether it be sacred games or whole lot of them, which have been, Tandav is the most recent example. And we also see the aggregators like Daily Hunt. They're actually just aggregating news. Now, what we know is that the mainstream media, the traditional media, some would call them the legacy media, came together because they were being badly hit. And they lobbied hard, and there were enough sympathizers within the government to listen to them. And so the government started slowly but surely, and this process is still continuing, to control what appears on websites and what appears on television news, on news outlets on digital platforms. So whether it be in the kind of foreign direct investment that they can get, and or what you can put out and what you can't, and where the government can intervene and how the government can intervene, we see a shift in looking at controlling them, not so much the judiciary, but the executive. Now, media regulation is a huge issue. And maybe on some other occasion, if there are enough people who want to hear me, I teach the subject. There is a state of anarchy as far as India is concerned. You have a Sudarshan TV and you know what has happened and what the Supreme Court has said about Sudarshan TV. But you have a multiple number of government bodies as well as self-regulatory organizations, government bodies. The Central Board of Film Certification, affectionately called the Censor Board, the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, the Press Council of India, CERT, the Computer Emergency Response Team, which is part of MeitY, the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. Then you have these self-regulatory bodies, whether you have the Advertising Standards Council of India, you have the News Broadcasters Association and the News Broadcasting Standards Authority, you have the BCCC, I could go on and on and on. So you have all these regulatory bodies, statutory bodies, as well as bodies which are self-regulatory industry bodies, but they don't seem to be working. We live in a different day and age. As I mentioned, and I go back to where I started, in the palm of your hand, in this phone I have enough computing power, which 20 years ago or 25 years ago or 30 years ago would take server space, which would fill up this room and more. This is my newspaper, this is my magazine, this is my book, this is my radio station, this is my television channel, and more, because it's not just a medium of mass communication, it's also a medium of personalized communication. Controlling the media and how you control the media is really a huge issue. And do we need a constitutional body? A body which will recognize that today the media cuts across different platforms, the written word, the spoken word, and the audiovisual media. What kind of a body? This is a subject of greater discussion, and I'll be happy to answer some of your questions, because Mr. Shamal Bakshi says that media should be regulated. Of course, it should be regulated, but how, who, when? Self-regulation, is it enough? Take Sudarshan TV. Did it self-regulate itself when it put out hateful information? Where does self-regulation work where you're not part of any of these industry bodies? So in an ideal world, if we were all very good, then everybody would stop smoking because it was bad for your health. I say that as a former smoker. Would you need those ghastly pictures on your cigarette pack saying smoking causes cancer and is injurious to health? If we were living in a utopian world, yes, self-regulation would be indeed the best way. I see Rich Patil, my friend from Bangalore, raising this question. But we don't live in an ideal world. And because self-regulation doesn't work, we also need other kinds of regulation. And that itself is a subject of another discussion. But to return, and I've been speaking now for about 25 minutes, little more than 25 minutes. In a few minutes, I'm going to stop. I want to summarize the main points that I raised. The media is today extremely subservient to those who are in positions of power and authority because it has been financially squeezed. That's one part of the story. And given what's happening across the world, the Great Recession, global, and now the Great Indian Recession, journalists are being thrown out of their jobs. Not enough people are getting jobs in the profession. Those who had jobs, they've been asked to accept deep salary cuts or just leave. There used to be a system, which was the Working Journalists Act. But journalists were told, if you do not want to be part of the act gave you certain safeguards, a certain kind of security. But if you want more money, then you opt out. Then you go in for short-term contracts which can be renewed perhaps every 11 months or more. So this was the way it all happened. Again, Mr. Shamal Bakshi used to say that the media barons, this is their side business interest. It used to be like that. Yes, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, our first Prime Minister, V.K. Krishna Menon used to talk about the jute and steel press. We know the late Ramnath Goenka, who founded the Indian Express, at one point of time wanted to buy the Indian Iron and Steel Company. And yes, there were attempts. I mean, there are business people with interests. Who's the biggest baron? Who's the biggest among the biggest media barons in the country? It's Reliance Industries Limited. Mr. Mukesh Ambani, India's richest man, Asia's richest man, one of the world's richest men. Now, he controls that. It's a huge media empire, Network 18. It has many, many languages. Now, predictably, you can't find anything that would be critical of him in any of those media channels. But you have other such. But you also have the Jains, for instance, Vineet Jain, Samir Jain. They are the heads of the Times of India. Their company, Bennett Coleman Company Limited, is not publicly listed. Otherwise, they would also be among the richest men in India. But until recently, they would very proudly claim that the Times of India is the world's most widely circulated multi-edition English daily newspaper. That Bennett Coleman was indeed one of Asia's biggest publisher. So we have these big conglomerates. Many of them actually made profits in the media. Many of them, for them, the Fourth Estate was one part of the story. Real estate, Fourth Estate became real estate. But look at the publishers of the Dainik Jagran, the Dainik Bhaskar, two of the most widely circulated Hindi daily newspapers in the country and among the most widely circulated daily newspapers in the world. Yes, post-COVID, everybody's taken a hit, so have they. But you also see how all these papers, because of their dependence on government advertising, are also uncritical of the ruling dispensation. Okay. AG, I'm going to start answering some of the questions because I've spoken for half an hour. For those who question the integrity of Paran Joy, he was a flag bearer of 2G controversy. Paran Joy does not align himself with any party and therefore finds himself difficult to be part of media houses. AG, well, this is part of the story. It's a fact what you said, that yes, for the first and only time in my life, no, first time, not only time, first time in my life, I became a petitioner. Mr. Prashant Bhushan asked me to sign on a blank piece of paper, and willy-nilly I ended up becoming a petitioner in the so-called 2G, second generation spectrum scam. I even made a documentary film, which you can see on my website. It's called The Great Indian Telecom Robbery. And then the Delhi High Court threw out the petition. And some of my dear friends said, why are you getting into all this? You're a journalist. Don't become an activist. Why are you a petitioner? And then when the Supreme Court upheld judgment, and Justices Singhvi and Ganguly, if my dates are right, February 2012, cancelled over 200 licenses, everybody said, "Vah re vah re vah. You're not just a journalist, you're making change." So anyway, the short point is, during those days, it was not just 2G and CWG, the Commonwealth Games, and it was not just Jija G, I mean Robert Vadra, and it was not just Colgate. The BJP loved me. They would, frequent me and pat me on my back and said, "Wow, wow, wow." Today, I'm seen to be the same people say you're a supporter of the Congress. I said, come on, check my track record. You're right, AG. I do not think I've aligned myself with any party. I know people in every party. I dare say I even have friends in every political party. But I've never been a member of a party, but so what? This whole thing about journalists being objective, this whole thing about journalists being biased or unbiased. You know, in 77, when I became a journalist for the first time, the late Bhavani Sengupta, he was my first boss. He was the first editor. I was lucky, even before I'd completed my master's degree from the Delhi School of Economics, I got a job. And he said, come to Kolkata. And that's right. And he told me that, I'll give you a princely salary of 800 rupees a month. And yeah, you will become my assistant. And I said, oh my God. Down the road in the Statesman, you didn't become assistant editor till your hair was gray, etc., etc. But Bhavani Sengupta told me something very, very important. He told me that don't ever be ashamed of saying that you're biased. We are individuals. We are all biased. We all have our biases. We all have our preferences, our likes, our predilections. If you ask somebody to make a report out of what you've said for the last half an hour, people will have different points they'll highlight. Points they will highlight, put right on top, or points they will highlight, or they will relegate to the background. But what is important, and this is what he kept saying, be sure of your biases. Be proud of your biases. Can you say, I am biased in favor of the underprivileged? I want to give a voice to the voiceless. I want to help the exploited, those who have been treated in an unjust manner. Can you say, I am biased against those who are corrupt? I am biased against those who abuse their power and their authority. Yeah, so we are biased, and we have to be biased. The very facts we select, the very facts we highlight, they all teach us about our biases. And I'm not in the least ashamed to say that we all have to be biased. Let's argue. Let's discuss. I'm going to take a few questions that came along the way. Mr. Shamal Bakchi has been asking me a number of questions. Do you care to comment on the Radia tapes? How a certain Mr. Arora became our CEC after those tapes? That's a very good question. I just had a discussion with the former IAS officer, Mr. Jahar Sarkar, and he made a lot of comments. You're indeed right. Mr. Sunil Arora, who recently demitted office as the Chief Election Commissioner, he does feature in the Radia conversations. It's not very tough. You just use the services of Google Guru, as Mr. Modi describes Google. Type out Sunil Arora, Radia Conversations, Outlook magazine. Mr. Vinod Mehta did put them out. You'll hear his voice. He's never denied that's not his voice. What is he saying about a judge? Influencing the judiciary. You can say, so what's new? So judges are part of society, journalists are part of society. If journalists, if society, they're members of society that are corrupt, why are you surprised that there is corruption in the media? If large sections of our society are corrupt, then why are you surprised that judges are corrupt? Well, that's what Mr. Arora has talked about. But if you do, if you want to know more about the role of the Election Commission of India and the Chief Election Commissioner in especially during the ongoing Bengal elections, the legislative assembly elections in West Bengal, I would strongly recommend to you শ্রী শ্যামল বাগচি, আপনি দয়া করে শুনে নেবেন। জহরদার সঙ্গে আমি একটা প্রায় 40 মিনিট, I speak to him with him for about 40 minutes. He argues and very effectively argues why the Election Commission of India has been particularly biased in favor of the BJP in the Bengal elections, which are still going on as we talk. As for yeah, good. Thank you, Sujata. Sujata is a dear friend. She's an office bearer of the Delhi Union of Journalists, and she's happy that I'm talking about a bias and objectivity. You know, this word objective, it's a loaded word. We can talk on and on about this. And Mr. Bagchi, social media rules, I already mentioned this to you. The government wants to use this whole, to me, it's an excuse that they're going to clamp down on fake news, they're going to clamp down on false information and misleading information and hateful speech. But this has also become an excuse to control the section of the media which is still being critical of the government. This is what I fear. This is what I apprehend. On this subject too, I've been talking and speaking about it. There's a lot that can be said in this on this subject. But let's go back for a moment to the Radia conversations. I mean, it was Open Magazine. Manu Joseph was the editor. Mr. Vinod Mehta, the late Vinod Mehta. I consider myself privileged that I worked under him for about 5 years. And they went ahead. They took a huge risk. The Radia conversations were known. The Mint had it. That's under the Hindustan Times. The Times of India had it. They had all kinds of reasons why they didn't use it. In fact, a prominent newspaper had actually prepared a full page with different variations where the names were mentioned, in another case the names were not mentioned. Because if you go back chronologically, in no time, as soon as the Radia conversations were out, the rest of the media went to town and talked about what was happening. The interesting part of the story is they couldn't have done this. I mean, the Radia conversations ran into days. There were journalists who literally spent all night listening to the conversations and taking out what would be described as the quote-unquote juicy parts of this conversation. But that's what happened. That's what happened. And what the Radia conversations clearly established was something that everybody knew. Yes, there's a nexus between business and politics. We know about that. We talk about that. In hushed whispers, these days, thanks to the social media and everything, we don't know what is private and what is not. But the point is, in this nexus between business and politics, the media plays a key role. And we know what happened. There were a few journalists who were named. I have no hesitation naming them. Prabhu Chawla, Veer Sanghvi, Barkha Dutt. They are all very, very experienced journalists. I mean, some of the most fantastic reportage on the lockdown has been done by Barkha Dutt, Mojo. But the point is, at that juncture, it was perceived that they were part of that nexus. They were trying to influence ministerial appointments. They were trying to play more, they were trying to do more than journalism. So this is really the point on which I want to sort of go on and tell you a little bit. And this is, you know, as I told you earlier, I teach. I teach about the media. I teach about journalism. Some of it is based on my own personal experiences. And I do believe that it is important to understand that you should not categorize all journalists in the same category. I mean, you can't put all the journalists in the same category. And, you know, I have, when I teach about journalism and I teach youngsters about journalism, I make this comparison between journalists and dogs. Once I made this comparison while speaking in my broken Hindi in an educational institution in Gwalior some years ago. There were people who were very, very angry with me. There were people who were very, very upset with me. क्या अपने आप को क्या समझते हैं? आप पत्रकार लोगों को कुत्ते के साथ तुलना करते हैं? अपनी सांबादिक আপনি বলছেন আমরা কুকুরদের মতো? I was on the defensive. And then I started saying, no, dogs are man's best friend and women's best friend and human beings' best friend, etc., etc., etc. But I draw a certain analogy. And I want to tell you this because one should not categorize everybody in the same brush. There are journalists who are journalists only by name. They actually act as representatives of advertising agencies. There's nothing wrong in advertising. There's nothing wrong in being part of an advertising agency, but then you're clear. You are acting on behalf of a particular client. It could be a person, it could be a political party, it could be a corporate, and you are supposed to promote that party's interest. You're being paid to do that. Or you're in a public relations department. Public relations, it's a very honorable job. Your job is to promote the interests of certain individuals or certain organizations or companies to the public at large. It's an important role you play. But then what is the role of a journalist? The so-called fourth estate. You are supposed to provide information to your readers, to your listeners, to your viewers. You are supposed to provide information that is as factual as you possibly can. You're supposed to get views of all kinds. You're supposed to be you have to try and be as balanced in your coverage. As I mentioned earlier, that's not easy. And it's often impossible. But you try and get opinions. But then there are people who manipulate, who master. They're spin masters, as they are called. This was a term that was used in the United States first. Sorry, I beg your pardon, in the United Kingdom first. 10 years ago, I wrote a book called Media Ethics. It's a textbook. It's still used. Oxford University Press published it. But to get back to my original thesis about journalists and dogs. You know, when journalists, young budding journalists are taught in their first year, their first class, they are taught man bites dog. That's big news. Not dog bites man. Dog bites man is no news. Dog keeps biting man. Dogs keep biting man. But only if a man bites dog is it news. But then a former editor of mine said it all depends on who the dog bites. If dog bites Mr. Narendra Modi, it would be big news. If dog bites Mr. Amitabh Bachchan, it would be big news. Or Miss Priyanka Chopra. So it depends on who the dog bites. Secondly, it's not a question of dog biting man or man biting dog. It's a question of what sells. It is said it leads if it bleeds. That journalists are obsessed with the dark, negative side. Today we hear, as I'm talking, there's absolute, this country's healthcare system has collapsed. People known to me, relatives of mine, my own brother-in-law, my first cousin's daughter, they are no more. They've been killed by the COVID. My own family members are suffering, including my wife. She hasn't tested COVID positive as I'm talking about. We've come into contact with people who are COVID positive. There is absolute devastation in this country as we talk. But I'm talking to you about something else. What about the media coverage? How many of people are saying, let's talk about all that is happening, all the terrible things that are happening, the oxygen shortage, people dying because of oxygen shortage, the politicking. Or is it the job of the journalist to spread good news and make people say, oh, look, be happy that you're alive? Good news? Is good news no news? Is bad news only good news? What is the hallmark of a democracy? I ask you these questions because these are not easy questions to answer, but I'll nevertheless raise them. So there are dogs, there are dogs, there are journalists, and there are journalists. Journalists are sometimes called the watchdogs of society. We have a dear dog at home, and once there was a burglary attempt on our house, and my wife and our children, we fell in love with this guy. He had been uh, abandoned, so we said, no, he'll probably be our best burglar alarm, but I'm not so sure. But our dear doggy was there for us. But there are dogs that can bark but cannot bite. But that's all right. If the thief has come at 4 o'clock in the morning and trying to rob you and doesn't know that the dog can only bark but not bite, so what? The dog is doing its duty. But, and here I talk about a phrase that Ravish Kumar, who's one of the finest television anchors in this country, he talked about the Godi media. Godi, lap. There are dogs that will sit on your lap very comfortably. It'll just wag its tail, you can stroke it. Especially if the lap belongs to a powerful politician, a very highly placed civil servant or bureaucrat, or a military general or a mafia don. And there are other dogs. There are guide dogs. There are dogs that can sniff out drugs or explosives from a pile of luggage. There are dogs that can help a visually challenged person cross the street. You've heard about the famous Saint Bernard's dogs in Switzerland who rescue people in the midst of a blizzard, a snowstorm. I see a lot of my friends here, and I'm truly honored and privileged that they're here. Mr. Nambiar, Surendra Nambiar, Frederick Norona from Goa has asked a large number of questions. The dominance of the government as an advertiser in our times might not be sufficient to apt the lack of bite, large sections. It's not sufficient, but certainly an important reason. There are more factors than this, including the 1947 nationalistic approach. Yes, sure. But even during the times, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was a journalist. So was Pandit Nehru. So was L.K. Advani. So was Atal Bihari Vajpayee. To be a journalist was, politicians were journalists. That's how they reached out. Gandhi's publications didn't have a very high circulation, but they were perceived to be so dangerous, they were shaking the might of the mighty British Empire. So yes, this being of a nationalist approach was always there. I'm not saying that today is the first time we see journalists who are pro-government. Yes, they've always been there, but I see more of them. I see a bigger section of the media unwilling to hold truth to power, to question those who are in power. Okay, dominance of Delhi and its agenda in the media. Yes, of course, this is part of our culture. I completely agree with you that the media is very, very Delhi-centric, but so is our country. Over-centralized. I think after a long, long time, certainly since the mid-70s and 1977, we've seen so much power concentrated in the hands of so few people, and they are here in Delhi. Of course, I completely agree with you. So in that sense, what's happening in the media is also reflecting part of the bigger political economy of our country. Okay, lack of successful alternative role models. Okay, you've talked about German and American publications. Also, we in the media want to have our cake and eat it too. Good salaries won't easily go with an independent media. Yes and no, You want a journalist to live on hope and idealism by paying that person poverty wages. That works or doesn't work. It works sometimes. It doesn't work sometimes. Kappan Siddique, he was reporting. He's still in jail. Mr. Arnab Goswami, my dear friend, the Supreme Court doesn't find time to discuss a whole lot of things. But yes, Mr. Arnab Goswami's bail application was dealt with rather expeditiously. Yes, how can the media get the Prime Minister to hold a press conference? Seriously, I don't know. What about the conflict of editors' bias with the reporters' bias? Of course, there are biases. Editors are biased, reporters are biased, owners are biased. But I think it was always there. But today we have a nameless editor. I don't know how many of you know the editors of some of the major newspapers in this country. the proprietor. Once upon a time, there used to be the Chinese wall. There were Chinese walls between the owners and the editor, between the journalist, the journalistic or the editorial side and the advertising side. But those were days. Those were days. I see less of it now. A poor democracy endangers a poor media. Sure, sure. Who are not? What would you like to talk about? Kuhu Mitra asked me, does caste have a role to? Ashley De Mello said, caste have a role in how topics are covered in the media? Of course. Of course. Much of the media is upper caste. It has a bias. It has an upper caste bias. Very few Dalits, very few tribals are represented in the media. Of course, so completely true. Yes, we get the media we deserve. Of course, we get the media. We get a democracy we deserve. Yes, but today, given the state, the fragmented state of the political opposition, given the fact that we find the opposition completely fragmented, even if the non-NDA parties in 2019 got about 45% of the vote, 55% of the vote. The NDA got 45% of the vote. The BJP got 37% of the vote. The media has a role to play in a democracy. Democracy is not about voting every 5 years. Democracy is something that happens all the time. Now, let me take this issue about Kuhu Mitra. Personal threat. Of course, there's a personal threat. You look at what's happened in the last year and a half. The number of journalists who've either been jailed, who've had first information reports lodged against them, journalists who have been hauled up in court, journalists who've been threatened, journalists who have been threatened that your children are going to be kidnapped, your property is going to be destroyed, journalists who have died. You don't believe me? Look at international bodies. Go to our Reporters Sans Frontiers. Go to the international IFJ, the International Federation of Journalists. Go for the CPJ, the Committee for Protection of Journalists. Look at their data. And you see how India's track record in the media has been pathetic. We call ourselves a democracy, and this is a question that came up earlier, the world's largest democracy, but this is one aspect of the democracy where we become weaker. Okay. Anil Patni, again, dear friend, a lot of people are joining. Total dependence on the media houses on advertisements, key reason. Yes, I indeed have exactly, earlier in the conversation, I've used exactly the phrase you have said, you have written, he who pays the piper calls the tune. Okay, thank you. Yeah, you're just repeating what I said. What unleashed Padmaja Shaw, my friend from Hyderabad, she asked me what unleashed the pandemic of Islamophobia on mainstream media. I think this has got the Islamophobia, which the media amplified, is also completely in tune with the Islamophobia of the ruling dispensation. A year ago, the whole Tablighi Jamaat episode, look at the way the mainstream media talked. It was almost as if it was people who belonged to one particular religious community who were responsible for spreading the coronavirus in Delhi. I ask you, was the same media, the same journalists, the same television channels equally critical of what's happening in Hardwar, in the Kumbh? What is happening where elections are being conducted? Yes, no, they're not being critical. So what unleashed the pandemic of Islamophobia, Padmaja? It's because the media has become an integral part of the ruling dispensation. And therefore, they are doing exactly what the ruling dispensation wants it to do. Today, given the terrible situation, the healthcare situation, they are saying spread positivity. Thank you, Raghu Kochar, for your nice comments, for your refreshing comments. You were saying refreshing, breath of fresh air. Yes, thank you, Anil Patni, once again. Ranjan Basu says, hello, Surendran. Does social media change reporting significantly? Yes. Social media is changing reporting, but it's changing reporting in positive ways. But I dare say the negative side of it is far, far worse. Positive ways, yes, it's difficult to keep the truth away. There are people on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook So even if there are people who want to cover up something, it's not easy. It's become that much more difficult to cover up. But what is also happening simultaneously is that that same social media is being used to propagate falsehoods, spread hate speech, hateful, and put out not just pornography. This is what also gives the government the handle. Ki look, so and so has put out a video. Here is a person in Rajasthan who killed another person, and his nephew shot that ghastly, gruesome video and disseminated it. But because there is end-to-end encryption, Facebook was not going to tell us who put it out and who it went to. So that's why the government says we want traceability. We want to know who the originator of the content. But unfortunately, this is a double-edged sword. So in doing that, they would also possibly clamp down on dissent. Shishuraj, my dear friend, you are saying, is it misleading the country? Yes, of course. The mainstream media is often misleading the country. It doesn't do it all the time, but it often does. I mean, tell me, was there critical reporting about what happened along the line of actual control or the line of control in Ladakh recently? Today, the stories are coming out. What were the real stories about demonetization? Why was there demonetization? Yeah, it didn't affect Mr. Modi's popularity. Immediately after demonetization, the Bharatiya Janata Party won handsomely in Uttar Pradesh. The way in which the goods and services tax was put together. Most recently, what about the lockdown? What about the Home Secretary of India, Mr. Ajay Bhalla, through the Solicitor General of India, Mr. Tushar Mehta, telling the Chief Justice of India, Mr. Sharad Bobde, he recently demitted office, that this is on the 31st of March 2020, that there is not a single migrant on the highways. People have forgotten it. You can get away with it. We saw the biggest internal migration in the history of India and perhaps the history of humankind. The number of people, crores of people left their homes. And the government gets away by uttering what I consider it's a lie. A lie. Can't be a bigger lie than this. Ranjan Basu, that's why journalists have become part of the ruling party, of course. There are journalists in all the parties. Yeah, it's lucrative. Maqbool Syed, how many COVID-19 deaths will awake Modi Bhakts from the slumber? How many deaths will it take till it knows that too many people have died? Bob Dylan, Robert Zimmerman. The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. I don't have answers to all these questions. But I'm seeing today maybe a change. Maybe I am imagining it. I was asked this question, are you seeing a change in perception? Are the same people who supported the ruling dispensation, how do they act? How do they act when their family members are dying? When their old loved ones, their near and dear ones, they're unable to get a hospital bed, unable to get an oxygen cylinder. What happens? Achhe din kab aayenge? They're asking that question. Shujan, my friend, has asked a very important question. How viable are independent digital news platforms in India? Right now, it's given the government and the way the government's rules are being framed, they're trying to squeeze the digital media. Viability is a big question. How can they be viable? We have a couple of organizations in this country, including the IPSMF, the Independent and Public Spirited Media Foundation, who have been giving out essentially what are grants. Now, in my opinion, this is my opinion, that the subscription model is yet to really take off. We don't have that many of them in India or in the world. New York Times today is earning about half its total revenue through subscriptions. We have subscription-only websites, including the Morning Context, including the Ken. We have here newspapers like the Hindu and Business Standard, who also, their digital offerings are not free. You have to pay for it. So subscriptions is one part of the story. Philanthropies, grants, foundations giving money to media channels, that's another part. That's another way. And the third part, I do believe, is crowdfunding. If you do not want to pay for the content, if you do not want to pay for quality information, researched information, double checked, verified, triple checked information, if you want everything free, you have enough of fake news, enough of trash, take it. But if you want content which is credible, which is authenticated, which is quality, or of a superior quality where all the checks have been made, then ask yourself, are you willing to pay for it? And if you're not willing to pay for it, then what? So in my opinion, even as these models are evolving and we are all trying to figure out how digital media, news media platforms will survive, in my opinion, these are the few ways. Grants, trusts, philanthropies, give donations without any expectation of any profit or any return. Point number one. 2, subscribers. 3, crowdfunding. These are all interlinked. To my mind, these are the ways you can survive. Arunima Joshi, will IT cells of rich political parties eventually overtake digital news? Arunima, they've already taken over. I mean, the kind of money they're spending is not funny. There's enough young people who are unemployed in this country. You pay a young man or a young woman every month, tell her or him that I'm going to give you a certain amount of money, 30,000, 40,000, 50,000 rupees. And I'm going to give you a laptop. I'm going to give you a computer. And I'm going to give you access to, you're going to get 8 or 10 SIMs. You have to do nothing. You just have to just keep abusing A, B, C, D. That's the story. Anonymity is, again, that two-way sword. I mean, a lot of people support anonymity. They said, yes, that's one of the great things about the social media is that you can be anonymous. You don't have to be Paranjoy Guha Thakurta or PGT. You can be 1, 2, 3, 4 or XYZ. But as others have pointed out, more often than not, those who are targeted, they are real people. They're the one, not just with blue ticks in their Twitter account, they are real individuals. That picture is their picture that you see on their display, what they've displayed. Those organizations are real. But the people who are attacking them, they are not. They are anonymous. I know I've blocked hundreds of people. I've muted hundreds of people. Once in a while, my complaints have been recognized by the algorithms of these social media platforms. Once upon a time, they didn't have human interference. Now they're trying to have more human interference. So, I mean, this is again somewhat facetious, but if somebody on the social media says UMC, UBC, most of you know what I'm talking about, what MC means, what BC. Does that algorithm, does that machine know whether MC is one thing or it means master of ceremonies? Whether BC means you are committing an incestual act or whether BC is before Christ. So yes, I'm being facetious, but at the same time, I'm trying to be also serious to try and tell you that there are various reasons. So I have actually been speaking almost continuously now for more than 1 hour, 1 hour and 5 minutes. और बहुत सारे सवाल आप लोग ने उठाया, अनेक प्रश्न आपनारा करेছেন. Raghu Kochar, can a free press survive in an increasingly command and control scenario? Any examples? देखिए, free press. What is a free press? Putin's opponent, we don't know whether he'll survive or not. If you want to know about those who have been opposing the Chinese regime, but why only Russia and China? Read the organizations that critique the media in the United States. Why did Twitter, which was used by Donald Trump the most, why did Twitter at the end block him? when there was violence on Capitol Hill. Why? The question is, to a lesser or a greater extent, what is happening across the world is getting reflected in India. But just as we see the rise of right-wing demagogues, just as we see the rise of right-wing authoritarianism, not just in the US or UK, in Hungary, in Turkey, in Brazil, we're also seeing it in India. In some ways, there are similarities, but there are also a lot of dissimilarities. And we have to move on, and we have to move on. I have spoken a lot of time, and I thank you all very much for being a part of this conversation. And it has been my honor and my privilege. I have a vested interest. I'd like you to subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'd like you to visit my website, paranjoy.in. I'd like you to contribute to my work. I tell you, I want your support. I'll take care of my children's education. But I need your support to carry on the work I'm doing. Visit my website. See the kind of work I'm doing. See the kind of issues that people like me, I'm not alone, many people like me are trying to do. And if you believe that the work I'm doing deserves your support, then please support. And it's not a question of me, an individual, coming to you with a begging bowl. Yes, I am coming to you with a begging bowl. But I also am trying to explain to you that we are living in very, very difficult and challenging times. And I'm not alone. And if you believe that you can have a look, and if you subscribe to my channel, and if you visit my website, you can have a look at what I'm doing. I'm trying to work across platforms. I'm currently facing some lawsuits for defamation. I've written a book I've co-authored a book on defamation with Shubir Ghosh. He's also the administrator of my website. It's called Sue the Messenger. Yes, there are many subjects I've just touched upon. Maybe if you are interested, you can write to me and I can try and see if I can have similar conversations. As I told you, this is the first time I'm having such a conversation. We can have similar conversations on other subjects, maybe some things that would be more focused. Rahul Chaudhary, whenever you write a piece, we receive it in our mail. Thank you so much. It's only some things I'm trying to do of late. You know, monetizing content on the net is damn tough. Even when I have a large number of subscribers, the lion's share of the advertising revenue is taken away by the digital platforms, including the platform I'm in on right now. We get a small share. It's not easy to monetize content unless you want to do things which you don't want to do. I don't want to make pornography. I don't want to put out stuff which is sensational. Thank you, Kuhu Mitra. Yes, I've received many legal notices, including legal notices from some of the richest men in India. Yes, and some of them have taken me to court. Should I treat those legal notices as love letters? Should I treat those court notices as badges of honor? The choice is yours. So I just wanted to tell you that I'll be grateful for your support. I'd be grateful for your visits to my website. Do you think independent, Vish Patel says, do you think independent journalists and smaller media houses have very little say or freedom to do their jobs? Yes, indeed, you are right. Indeed, you're right. So we have to fight. We have to continue the battle. It's not an easy battle. It's a tough fight, but we have to continue. If you give up, those on the other side have won. At 65, I'm still trying to reinvent myself. I've done something which I haven't done all my life. I made a music video. And it's really about a group called Fiddler's Green from Kolkata. It's made in Bengali with English subtitles. I have a documentary on the Bengal situation coming up in the next couple of days. That's it. I'm going to continue my work. And I thank you once again for your support, and you keep well. And all the very best. Namaskar. And feel free to get in touch with me. You can connect to me through my website. And if some of you want to speak with me, and you write to me first, and then we can see how we can take it forward. And thank you for all the kind comments and all the generous words of praise and the compliments that have been showered on me. Shourid Day, people I don't know. DP Roy, you missed most of the talk, but it's all going to be on YouTube. You can have a look at it once again. Thank you once again. Namaskar. It's 7:10. Have a good evening.